Whether you know a lot about skip loading or you know nothing at all, I'm going to throw about 15 years of experience at you as far as carbohydrate loading, skip loading, the differences between high carbohydrate, low fat skip loading, which is referred to as traditional skip loading, or the other one being the moderate fat, moderate carb skip loading. I'm also going to cover the off-season skip loading versus contest prep or just dieting phases for skip loading. The high fat versus low fat skip load is something that I have come to in the last few years. It actually started in 2012 when I was competing. Give you a little background. I started about 18 weeks out to prep for that show, and by 15 to 16 weeks out, I had a full day skip load and was beginning to start the loads the night before, close to bedtime, and then running the entire next day. So metabolically, I was running at 110% at 14, 15, 16 weeks out. And I remember thinking to myself, where do I go from here? I can't really load anymore. I can't take the load to a day and a half or 2 days. It just would have been too much. So one of the things that I started running into, or one of the things that I noticed at that time, was something that had never happened before. And I had skip loaded and competed using skip loading for 10 years prior to that. Numerous shows, with the process being quite uneventful. I mean, it worked the way it was supposed to. I got into great condition. There were a couple times, one time in 2010 where I was off. I mean, it happens. But by and large, it was incredibly successful. I got into excellent condition, and there were no real hang-ups. 2012, though, was a little bit different in the sense that I started having what was essentially hyperglycemic issues the first meal or two of the day. I was taking in high carbohydrate meal, low fat, traditional skip loading at that time. Again, 14, 15, 16 weeks out, quite a ways out. And with this side effect, I found it disturbing because for the first time I was thinking to myself, the signs were obvious. As an example, my vision was a little blurry. So it wasn't necessarily, they were sugary carbs or anything. Yes, they were sugary carbs, but I also have always had a pretty good balance of sugar versus starch in the meals, especially the first couple meals of the day. So nothing was really different with these meals than any other prep or anything I had done prior. It was just the response that was different. So this happened for a couple weeks, and I thought to myself, this can't continue because obviously my body is not using the sugar and packing it away as efficiently as it could be or as it had in the past. So I essentially looked at it with two viable options. One being I use insulin. The other being I throw in some fat, bring the carbohydrate content down a little bit, take the fat up. That would help to slow the rate that the carbohydrate was hitting my bloodstream, and that may actually solve the problem. So at that time, I was not terribly pro-insulin in the sense that I just didn't use it a lot at that time with loading. Didn't really think that it was necessary at that time. Was having such good results without it that I saw no real reason to throw it in. Knew it was an option, but I went with the higher fat content first to see how that worked, which is, I think you see where I'm going here. This led to having essentially two options for skip loading. So what happened was, as predicted, the higher fat intake and bringing the carb. I still had a lot of carbs in there. It just wasn't this slam or this ridiculously high amount of carbs with little to no fat. And of course, all these carbs are processed, so there's no fiber to slow anything down, which is essentially the reason, that traditional skip loading has been so successful, is the processed carbs lacking fiber and being low fat, they're going to hit your bloodstream very, very quickly, and that's the whole point, to induce the endogenous insulin release and just start packing away those carbs in the form of glycogen pretty efficiently. So this being a different situation, changed the ratio of carbohydrate to fat, and it worked great. What it actually did was it allowed me to, later in the day, drop that fat down and continue the carbohydrate traditional skip loading with the high carbohydrate, low fat intake for the rest of the day, and didn't have any problems. So that was essentially my, introduction to the moderate fat, moderate carb version of skip loading. So I came across a couple clients who were having similar issues. This is actually twofold. Not only did I come across a couple clients who were having similar issues to what I was dealing with in 2012, but I also came across a situation where I was looking into the relationship between body fat levels and hyperinsulinemia, and the relationship, at least on paper, is pretty dramatic, pretty obvious. So I said to myself, based on my experience in 2012 and the fact that I had had a couple clients who needed that change as well, I started off prep phases for clients who are more endomorphic or just carrying a lot more body fat. I started them with the moderate fat, moderate carb skip loading, and then as they got leaner, the idea was to transition them to the traditional skip loading of high carbohydrate, low fat. So it may not have been, it wasn't going to be abrupt, but it was going to slowly change over time. Now, what I found that happened was when the moderate fat, moderate carbohydrate skip loading was working really well, and it continued to work well, a lot of times I just didn't change it. You probably heard me, if you saw the first DVD, refer to the mantra of, Mama said, don't fix what ain't broke. So as long as it was working, I wasn't going to change it up. And when I say working, not only just working, but working well. So a lot of these skip loads I just left alone. They worked really well, which is essentially what I did with my 2012 prep too. I had every intention of, even though I changed the carbohydrate later in the day, the first couple meals were moderate fat, moderate carb. So from there, they went back to traditional skip load meals later in the day. But I never, as I got leaner, changed the entire day to just the traditional skip loading, again, being high carb, low fat. I was having those blood sugar issues, so I just left it alone. If I remember correctly, when it got closer to the show, and I was down to like 4 or 5 weeks out, I actually stretched the moderate carb, moderate fat portion of the skip load, which was only a meal or two early in the prep, to almost half the day before I then transitioned back to the high carb, low fat for the rest of the day. So what this says too is, and it just reeks of individualism. It reeks of the fact that everybody is different. Though I believe strongly and have for years, and I have used my skip loading concept for 15 years, constantly trying to perfect it, constantly trying to make it better, it is still incredibly individual to that person. So that needs to be taken into account. If you're going to skip load, or you have skip loaded for years a certain way, it would be a good idea to take a closer look, maybe mix up the traditional skip loading with the moderate fat, moderate carb version, and see how you respond. Another thing that I need to make note of is, because the question you have maybe, well, what kinds of foods are you talking about? Is this more like shit loading? I can tell you matter of factly, shit loading, though awesome, and that's what I used to use 15 years ago that I learned from Zilla, that I continue to give him credit for, because without him not only taking me under his wing and teaching me shit loading, but without his approval and his okay with me tweaking shit loading to evolve into skip loading, I wouldn't be here discussing skip loading right now. I might be discussing nutrition and training, but it certainly wouldn't be skip loading, because without shit loading, there just never would have been skip loading. So I don't have anything bad to say about shit loading, other than I had worked with the shit loading for so long, and had tweaked it and changed a few things, in my opinion, to make it that much better. Shitloading worked really, really well for the smaller competitor. Bigger or larger framed competitors, you get into your heavyweights and super heavyweight, they can't fill out that quickly, especially if they're incredibly depleted. So I just found that they needed more time, they needed more food, and the shitloading concept then just wasn't as successful as it was with the smaller competitors. When I was able to make those changes and those tweaks, skiploading works pretty much across the board. Doesn't matter if you're a small competitor or a large competitor, because the timing is different, the amount of food is different, and there's so much more, a lot more individual variables involved that can be changed to accommodate that competitor or that client. So I do not use any form of shitloading these days, at least from a dieting standpoint. There are rare exceptions where a client responds so well to shitloading that I may use it as a peaking method prior to a show. Again, it's not very common, but I have been known to use it. Again, it's a very individual thing. It's not very common, it's not very frequent, but it is in there. But I don't use it at all for the prep phase or using skiploading strictly as a dieting protocol to get leaner. One of the main reasons is because I don't want to say it's not very healthy, but relatively speaking, I would rather have my clients taking in healthier food and meals over snacking and eating a bunch of crap. So, as an example, if I tell one of my clients, I want you to eat a burger and fries, I don't want, and I will specify, I don't want you going, to McDonald's or Burger King and eating garbage. Rather, you sit down at a restaurant or a bar and eat a quality burger with quality fries. And as an example, you might think, well, especially if you're anti-burger and fries, or anti-junk food, or anti-cheat meal, that you may find that humorous. But the reality is, again, when it comes to healthy foods, it's a relative term. Okay, McDonald's is shit compared to, say, Five Guys, who, cook their potatoes fresh and relatively local potatoes in peanut oil. Okay, big difference. Antibiotic and hormone-free beef and things of that nature, obviously, in my opinion, far superior to eating a crappy burger or crappy fries. And I just use that as one example. When I first got going with skiploading, what I ran into with clients was they wanted to snack a lot. They wanted to eat, a bag of gummy worms and half a tub of ice cream and that sort of thing. And that's where I changed and was more specific with the foods that I wanted clients to eat. And these days, and I'm not going to say that it didn't work, don't get me wrong, but again, it comes back to, you still want to get as much nutrition and nutrients out of your food as possible. And sitting back and eating, 3 bags of Twizzlers, a couple Pop-Tarts, and I don't even know, like throw something else in there that's bad and not terribly nutritious, is really nowhere near something like a meal that involves, let's say, gnocchi with, a spaghetti sauce or something along that line, sushi, just things of that nature. So the meals now for my skiploading, whether high fat or not high fat, moderate fat, moderate carb version, or traditional, I still try to get the clients to be focused as much around meals for those calories and carbs as much as possible. You could throw in a little snacking. If you have a meal and you have, 2 cookies, I don't care about that. You throw in some, pretzels or low-fat chips in the traditional skip-loading version following a meal, or some low-fat ice cream. That's fine. Those things are well within the skip-loading parameters. I don't have a problem with that. So my rule, to be clear when it comes to clients having skip load foods, is meals with a little bit of snacking, not snacking with maybe a meal. Now, you can still graze, and I still support grazing in between meals. That is where I encourage my clients to have a few snacks. Eat your meal, have a good meal that satiates. Again, I still stand by and have for years. You don't make yourself miserable when you're taking in these carbs and taking in these calories of food when you're loading. You satiate, you get full, you get nice and full. But you don't get miserable. You don't want to be, oh my God, I can't. And a good indication of this is if it's been a couple hours and you can't eat again, or 3 hours because you're so full, your ass ate too much. There is that break-in period of the first few weeks that you start skip loading that you have to figure out and tweak the volume of food that you're eating. The number one mistake that is made is everybody goes crazy on that first meal. And this almost happens to 100% of people the first couple of weeks when they first are introduced to skip loading. They get that first meal and then they're so full and they don't realize, really, they think, oh yeah, I'm good. I'm just satiated. I'm just kind of full. And then 3 hours later they go to eat a meal, and they get 5 bites in, and they're taking heavy, deep breaths, going, oh my goodness, I can't get this food in. That's where there has to be, as you progress through skip loading week after week, you figure out how much food you can get in and what that level of you being satiated and full really means without being too full. Because what will happen is you get that first meal in there, and then if you can't eat anything or much of anything for the next 4, 5, 6 hours, you'd be better off if you cut back on that first meal, and then you're able to be hungry again 2 to 3 hours later, and then hungry again 2 to 3 hours later as well. You get more food in that way, and you get more carbohydrates in that way without being miserable. And again, another thing that has not changed with skip loading over the years is using hunger as your gauge as to how much food you're taking in. And I understand that a lot of people don't like using hunger as a gauge. It's not black and white. It doesn't involve numbers. I get it. I am a very black and white person myself, and I struggled with it when I first started using it. And I just wanted to know how many carbs do I take in? Just tell me exactly how many and I'll take them in. And that just isn't how it works. The body, if you trust your body, it will tell you how depleted you are and how much you need. And I get tired of people saying, and I can understand their point when they're not familiar with skip loading and they don't understand how it works. But I get tired of hearing, bruh, you just don't understand how much I can eat. Okay? I don't care. You don't understand that I have done this a million times over. I've heard this from thousands of people, and I've proved them wrong. So, again, it comes down to being satiated, it comes down to hunger, and it comes down to not overeating. The other part that is important that I want to note is I have played around with keeping the protein in with the meals every 2 to 3 hours and taking it out. And what I have found over hundreds, if not thousands of people over the last 15 years, not only just people that I've worked with, but feedback that I have gotten from tons and tons of other people who have skip loaded without working directly under my supervision, is that it might be easier to leave the protein out from a convenience standpoint, but when you have the protein in there, it also helps to limit the amount of carbs that you get. The protein is still important, okay? So you still want to get your typical number of protein or typical amount of protein that you would normally get in each meal with your regular diet throughout the week. And I just tell people, like I always have, eat the protein first, get it out of the way, and then from there, fill up, get satiated on the carbs. That's the really still the best way to do that. So I strongly advise, if you're going to, either you've skip loaded for years or you're just now starting and you're experimenting with it and you want to know how it works and you're excited about it and yay, I'm going to eat pancakes until this is awesome, before you find out that it sometimes can be a chore. Get the amount of protein that you normally would get per meal every 2 to 3 hours while you're loading, and then fill up on the carbs from there. I used to say, as an example, no, the skip load has to start in the morning of one of your non-training days. I still stand by the non-training day. I know that bothers people tremendously because they think, oh, it would work so much better after a leg session or after a heavy back session, and then I can just go to town on skip loading. Just because it looks good on paper doesn't mean that when it's applied that it works better. I have done it both ways, over and over, hundreds if not thousands of times. The main, let's put it this way. It isn't that it isn't a good idea to do it after a workout. It'll work fine. The thing is, and this is what people forget, the next day is a non-training day. You're still depleted. Okay, you're dieting, you're using skip loading, and you're depleted. So there's little to no difference with your sensitivity to carbohydrate and insulin the following day than after your big workout. Okay, here's the main difference, and I understand it's very predictable for those of you who know the skip loading protocol, but I just want to reiterate this because it's important. What will happen with the large majority of people who skip load is your skip load window, the amount of hours that you're going to skip load, is going to potentially or usually increase over time, over the weeks that you diet. The more depleted, the leaner you get. Typically, the bigger the skip load gets. It is not uncommon, though not everybody loads this long, but it's not uncommon to skip load for 10, 12, 14, 16 hours a day, pretty much from the time you get up to the time you go to bed sometimes. If you're training in there, that's going to limit your skip load. It's going to essentially get in the way of the amount of carbs and food that you need to take in to thoroughly feed your metabolism and keep your metabolism smoking hot. Okay, so what happens is if I start a client skip loading after their leg day, then I have to figure out, do they train in the morning? Do they train midday? Do they train at night? Obviously, if they train at night, they're going to be very limited with the amount of hours they can skip load. I rarely start someone skip loading under 3 hours. So you would have to be done training, say and home, and have food in front of you by 8:30 if you have a typical bedtime of 11:30 or 12 o'clock. Okay, where do I go from there? Where does your skip load go from there? You have to then change the time you train, or you're going to be arguing with me going, well, maybe I could train, maybe I could load a little bit at night and the next in the morning. That's not how it works. So to get out of all this scheduling crap and keep it consistent, knowing that essentially the body is really no more or less sensitive to the carbs the following day after a training session, even though it's a non-training day, provided you're in dieting mode, okay, provided glycogen is depleted, you're going to suck those carbs up like a freaking sponge. So that opens the entire day to loading. You may not need it right away. It may only start at 3 hours. It may be to 6 or 7, and you still have a lot of time in the day. But that doesn't change the fact that as that time expands and that skip load window gets larger, you don't have anything in the way of that. The other thing that I recommend is do your skip load on a day, not only it's a non-training day, but do it on a day where you can be social. Typically that's on the weekend. Whether you have a family that you want to, be able to eat with, we all know, or most of us know, what it's like to diet either for a show or diet very strictly, where you're not having these meals with friends, you're not having these meals with your family, you're eating out of your Tupperware, sometimes with a scowl on your face. Sometimes you're sneaking your food into a restaurant and keeping the Tupperware underneath the table. I've done it. We've all done it. You're trying to be sneaky about it, that sort of thing. So try to add a little bit of socializing to your skip load. It's not, your skip load isn't there so you can socialize and be normal. It's there because it works to help you to burn more body fat than you otherwise would burn if you didn't do the skip loading. Okay, the side effect or the side benefits or fringe benefits, whatever you want to call them, are you do have some time that you can be normal with friends and family. So if you get that opportunity, schedule it around that. The time of day that you skip load does not matter. Okay, I used to say it needed to start in the morning because on paper it just made more sense. Plus, if you started in the morning, you would get in the routine of starting it in the morning, and then as your skip load time progressed and got larger, it would just stretch out further into the day. To me, it seems more consistent and routine to do that, but that doesn't mean that it would be to you. Again, going back to the social component, if you're going to load for 6 hours and you have a chance to eat dinner with your family on a Sunday, maybe your kids are coming over, they're going to watch football and everything like my kids do on a Sunday in the fall. Everybody comes over to the house. Yeah, I would like to be able to eat with my family than to eat earlier in the day, and then when they get there, then I have to go back to my Tupperware. Okay, if I thought it worked better doing that 6 hours or doing it earlier in the day and that it would get you leaner, I would stick to that. That's a no-brainer. I think that there's no difference. Obviously, if you don't start it until later in the day, you don't start the skip load till later in the day, then you need to have your regular dieting meals prior to that until you do start your skip load. That probably goes without saying, but I don't want to assume that you know exactly what I'm talking about either. Some people will fast. I don't recommend it. I think that you should still take in, at that point, at any point of time during the week, taking into consideration that you're skip loading once a week, your metabolism in theory is going to be the slowest at the end of the week before you start your skip load. So if it is its slowest and you're on your regular, dieting foods, or your dieting meals, I don't know that there's any benefit to fasting for those 4, 5, 6 hours on a Sunday prior to starting the skip load. You're not going to make your body more sensitive to carbs because you're already depleted anyway. If you weren't depleted, okay, maybe there would be a little bit of an argument for that. But you're depleted. Okay, you're depleted of glycogen. You are flattening out. You've lost a couple pounds of body fat, we assume, because that's usually how it goes or how it's supposed to go. So have your regular meals 2 to 3 hours before you start your skip load, and then hit your skip load. The one negative to starting the skip load later in the day is if you do get tired and you think, I just want to go to bed, then it becomes a fight in your brain as far as, I really want to go to bed, I'm exhausted, but I don't want to miss the last 2 hours or 3 hours of my skip load, so I'm going to stay up. Okay, you start early in the day, you don't have that battle. It's done, it's over with, you're going back to regular, boring Tupperware meals, and if you feel like falling in bed early, well, no big deal. You miss out on a boring, bland Tupperware meal. I have been referring to skip load for this discussion under the pretense that you are dieting, either for a show or to lose body fat. Neither one is really any different than the other, though contest prep, you have a deadline, and it's likely more extreme, the condition you're looking to get into. But as long as you're skip loading to lose body fat, the information that I have discussed so far pertains to that. Okay? The next area that I want to cover is not going to take very long, and that is the off-season skip loading, either ideology or protocol, whatever, however you want to look at it. My position on that has changed dramatically since the last DVD. Okay? The reason for that is more experience, more clients, and when I say more experience with me using it in the off-season, more experience with hundreds and hundreds of clients using it under my supervision, many more not under my supervision, but me getting feedback from them either email, through Intense Muscle, my website, or even on other boards for that matter. Really what has happened is the metabolic boost that you can get from skip loading is nowhere near as dramatic in the off season as I thought it was previously. Okay, it's still there in the sense that when you offset your caloric intake, for even just a day a week, even though you're in a surplus, it does kick your body out of that kind of homeostasis, or that predictable balance that it's looking to kind of get comfortable with. Okay, so that's a bonus. What I have found is, for anybody that I do have skip loading in the off season, it becomes more of a free meal or a free 2 to 3 meals than it really does any type of skip load. The main reason for that is skip loading essentially revolves around, or its premise is carbohydrate intake to replenish glycogen stores and offset the metabolism. Okay, without gaining body fat to feed the fat burning furnace, essentially. When you're not depleted, then there's really no way. I mean, the only argument that you could really have for continuing to skip load, I don't want to say hardcore, but really focusing on getting carbs in because your muscles are depleted, that sort of thing, would be if you're in the off season, you're running a surplus of calories, but you're on a bit of a keto diet or a very, very low carbohydrate diet. In a situation like that, even in a surplus, you can become depleted. Your muscles become depleted of glycogen, and you can benefit from the added carbs or the surge of carbs to help replenish glycogen stores. So I should probably be more clear and say it isn't that I don't believe in skip loading in the off season at all. What it is I don't believe in it as much or as strongly as I did years ago, specifically when I did the first DVD, would be a good example, and the effects that it has on metabolism and that sort of thing. So when I say 1, 2, 3 free meals, cheat meals, whatever you want to call them, I don't like the word cheat because it sounds shitloadish. It sounds crappy foodish. Okay, it sounds like I'm going to eat, a whole pepperoni pizza, and I really don't. I don't advocate for unhealthy eating like that. I understand sometimes it happens. People will go out and have a few beers. I don't, but I have when I was younger. You're going to eat pizza from time to time. Okay. If you're going to have pizza, I tell people all the time. I mean, I live in Colorado, so I have Bojo's. I'm spoiled here. I can get healthy pizzas. I can get low-fat pizzas. In 2010, I loaded for a show for skip loading on Bojo's Pizza, and was choosing pizzas from their what they call Smart Menu. I think it's called Smart Menu. Something to that effect. Anyway, there's 8 or 9 pies that are low fat, and because it's such a dry, floury crust, there's tons of carbs in it, and it's not oiled down like, say, Pizza Hut pizza that is just gut bombish, or Old Chicago. Old Chicago's actually a pretty good pizza, but it's heavy. It's very oily, it's very fatty. So if you can find a pizza that isn't, and you can put healthy toppings on it, or relatively healthy toppings, then great. Pepperoni, salami, things like that, those are fake meats, okay? They're just terrible. Matter of fact, the thought of eating pepperoni, it just, it makes me dry heave. But that's just me. Other people have the same issue with hot dogs or bologna. I don't know, pickle loaf, Brunswager. The list goes on and on. I was a poor kid growing up. I ate all that shit. Poor fat kid. So these meals, even though you're in your off season, obviously there's a little room for flexibility there, but I still push the health component. I'm an old guy. I'm a TRT guy. These things are important. I don't want to die of a heart attack tomorrow. And most of you the large majority of you in the same demographic, in our same age groups, our 40s into our 50s, you've been training a long time, maybe you lit a lot of gear, you've been training since the 80s. We're dropping like flies, fellas. Okay, it's heart attack after heart attack after fucking heart attack. The shit is scary. And it's made a lot of us pull back and reevaluate, which is the whole premise of this entire TRT bodybuilding DVD in the first place. It's to be able to continue what we do without killing ourselves or the risk of thinking that we're going to die in a week. So keep these foods healthy. They're still going to be tasty. You can have a quality burger and fries. You can have a steak and, loaded baked potato even with the dessert. These are healthier meals that are balanced and they have nutrients in them. Okay, you're getting good shit instead of just sitting down to a half tub of Ben and Jerry's or something like that, which is pretty good ice cream, don't get me wrong. But if you have, a cup, and I'm not saying measure it out, but if you have a cup of Ben and Jerry's after you have a quality meal, good for you. Okay, it's the other way around that's a concern. If you have, 2 pints of Ben and Jerry's and then you try to eat half of a steak and can't get it down because you're full from ice cream, that's what I'm trying to get you to avoid. So in short, the off-season skip loading, really only if you're going very, very low carb, maybe you're even sensitive to carbs. Like truly, not I'm just ultra like everybody thinks. But you truly are, you're older, you're not moving as much. I can relate. My carb intake is nothing of what it was 10 years ago. Nothing. So for me to add some extra carbs to my off-season skip loading actually benefits me a little bit. Okay? But if you're not depleted and your carb intake isn't terribly low and you don't feel like you're glycogen depleted by the end of the week, keep that loading down to, again, moderate fat, moderate carb. Have yourself a burger with some fries. And again, not stuffing yourself. You're eating to satiate, you're eating to be full, you're eating really in moderation. And you won't have any condition issues loading in that way. Is it strictly or is it truly skip loading? I would probably say not, because I tend to define skip loading these days really as just being focused around body fat loss. Okay? It's easier for me to call my off-season protocol of having a few cheat meals skip loading because I'm Skip. It kind of goes with the territory. Okay? So if you're going to have a few cheat meals on your off-season and, you're fat and you're not depleted and you go and you tell somebody you're skip loading, don't do that to me. Just tell them you're having like a free meal or something. Skip calls them free meals. That is essentially the off-season versus dieting skip load ideology and the comparison to traditional skip loading versus the moderate fat, moderate carb version of skip loading. Which one do I use more often? I would say that I still use the traditional more often, but to give you reference and give you comparison numbers, 6-8 years ago, maybe when the first DVD came out, I was probably 95% traditional skip loading, which again is high carb, low fat, and very small percentage. It was very uncommon to do a higher fat or moderate fat, moderate carb load. Now I would say, I don't know that they're necessarily 50-50, but they're pretty close. I'd have to look at the numbers to see because it might be a 60-40. Okay, I do a lot more loading with that fat in there than I used to. Not entirely, but much more than I used to, with excellent results. Excellent results. So the only other thing, and I'm not going to discuss it in this chapter, I'll discuss it in the next chapter as it relates to skip loading, is insulin, I have found, plays a very important part in making skip loading not only more efficient, but there's a lot of other things that go into it that I'm going to discuss in the following chapter. And the reason I'm not going to discuss it in this chapter in depth is just because there's a lot to it, and I don't want to drag this chapter out any more than I have to. Essentially, I'm going to have 3 skip loading chapters. So the next one I'm going to discuss is insulin's relationship to skip loading. And to some of you that may seem obvious. I've gotten questions in the past. Why don't you use insulin? Why don't you use it? Because it just wasn't needed for it to work well. But there are other things that have happened since then that are pretty crazy, that I never would have guessed that there was such an impact on skip loading. But I'm going to get to that in the next chapter and dive into the relationship between skip loading and insulin. I think you'll find it, even if you're not interested in using insulin, even if you don't think it's safe or whatever else, I think you'll find the information, at the very least, interesting or intriguing.